the idea that if there's something, we were talking about different types of beams, that if one beams, when they were constructing a building, if one beam is on top of the other beam, so we said that if there's a contamination on top of beam number one, let's say the first floor, or the roof of the first floor is the ground for the second floor. So if there's contamination on top of the roof of the first floor, but if there's a beam that's directly on top of that, so that beam would serve to stop the contamination from going higher than the ceiling or contain it. But anything that's underneath that would be considered underneath the tent of the beam. So we said if we look at the Chuf Beis Lamed Aleph, we'll look at 22A. We were at the end of the piece, 22A2 in the art scroll. Really at 22A3. 22A3. It says Alma. So the Gemara says V'tani Allah. We learned in the Braita, because we just spoke about different configurations of beams. One situation is that the beams are directly on top of each other, and one situation that the beams are not directly on top of each other, rather that the beams from the top floor would fill in the gap between the beams from the bottom floor. And we said if the beams from the top floor, we said they could fill in the gap, and therefore it makes it as if the bottom floor, the ceiling of the bottom floor, is one complete roof. Because let's say the bottom floor has a beam here, the space between each beam. But if the top floor has beams that would fill the space, the gaps, so we look at it as if that top floor beam actually filled the gap, and therefore the bottom floor now has a complete ceiling, and therefore if there's contamination under any of the beams on the bottom floor, so we would say the whole bottom, anything that's on the bottom floor would be contaminated. Any food, any drink, any utensils, but it's under one roof because there's a proper roof here. There's a proper OL. That's what we said. Good morning, Simon. We'll get to it. We want to welcome Mr. Bitesh, Ralph back. We've been waiting for Ralph to come back. Okay. Okay. There are a lot of people out there that are walking aimlessly, Mr. Bitesh. Thank God you're not walking aimlessly. Okay, so the Gemara said, and the Gemara said, Rava says that in order for something to serve this rule, that you could say that something which is not directly flush with something else, there are two different levels, that we would look at that item as if it fills the gap, is only true if the item that's filling the gap in itself has its own width of a tefach. If it's 3 to 4 tefachim wide, then we could say it lowers down. If it's not 3 to 4 tefachim high, if it's not 3 to 4 inches wide, we will not say that comes down and fills the gap. And Rava says, Omar Rava, and Rava said, right? We quoted Rava. Yep, sure. And Rava brought this case, and then the Gemara said, middle of this case, it says V'tani Allah. It's V'tani Allah in the art scroll. It's on page 22A3. V'tani Allah, and we learned in the Braita, Bamedvar Mamurim, when is this stated? If the beam has the size of a tefach, morning, Jaime.
Morning, Rabbi.
We are on 22A3, the top of the page, where we said the Tani Allah. We learned in the Braita, B'medvar Amurim, Only if the beam itself has a width of a tefach, but if you have a width of a tefach 3 to 4 inches, then you could serve as a tent. And between the beams, there's a space of a tefach. It's filling in that space of a tefach. But if there's not, if we don't have between the beams the size of a tefach, and therefore it's not filling a space of a tefach. If it's not that case, so then tumah tachas achas mehem. If there is contamination under one of the bottom beams, so tachtea tamei. The bottom beam, the given here is that each beam, the bottom beam is a tefach wide. So if it's a tefach wide, so therefore it serves as a tent for whatever's underneath that beam. So if there's contamination on one side of the beam, it'll go to the other side of the beam. Now, but beinehem, and between them, if you have utensils that are on top of the bottom beam, so we say the following. So let's say you have the bottom beam, and then there's that corpse underneath the bottom beam. So the bottom beam serves as a container because it's tefach wide. It will contain the contamination. Contamination will not go above that bottom beam. And the beinehem, and the utensils that are between the beams of the house and the beams and the containers that are between, and we say beinehem would be tahar. They would be tahar, because if you have utensils between beams on the bottom and beams on the top, let's say the bottom floor, the roof of the bottom floor, on top of the roof, you have utensils. But since the bottom floor served as a tent, it stops the contamination from going above. So the contamination is under the beams of the first floor. It remains underneath the first floor. Because the first floor, the roof of the first floor stops it from going higher, but the roof of the first floor is a tent that contains the contamination. So the Gemara says, Alma and Al Gabehem, and the Gemara says, and the Gemara continues, and it says like this: if, let's say, the beams were not directly on top of each other, and you have a situation that there are utensils on top of the bottom beams, so you have beam on the bottom, and you have utensils that are on top of that bottom beam. So we say tahar. We say in these cases it is tahar. It is pure, because once you have the bottom beam is a tefach wide, it will stop it from going above. Whether it has a beam on top, whether it doesn't have a beam on top, the bottom beam stops the contamination from going higher. So now the Gemara says, what's the whole proof from this point the Gemara wants to say? The proof is, Alma, we see, itbe tefach, if the beam, if it's the size of a tefach, if the beam is the size of 3 to 4 inches, we say, Amrinan chavut rami. We say, we look at that beam as if it goes down and it fills the gap. And less be tefach, if it doesn't have a tefach, lo amrina chavut rami shramina. So the point of this whole braita was to prove that we said there's a new halacha, the Gemara says. What's the new halacha? The new halacha is that you could have a situation that we find that you have beams that are not sitting right next to each other. One beam is above the other beam, but not directly above the beam. It's to the side, but above. Let's say the way we gave the example, beam right over here, and the next beam, instead of being right adjacent, it's up a certain amount. And we say if the beam is 3 to 4 inches wide, we say it comes down and it fills the gap, and it serves as a tent. And that's what the Gemara wants to say. The same thing for sukkah for schach. If you have a situation that you have a kosher piece of schach, but it's not sitting directly next to the other schach, it's higher up, and as a result that it's higher up, it creates more sun than shade. But if you apply this principle that we look at this schach that's raised as if it's lower down, and then at that junction, it would create more shade than sun. So we consider the sukkah as if this schach that's raised is as if it's lower down. And therefore, we're making a kosher sukkah. But we only do that provided that this schach has a certain width to the tef. To say that we're going to look at this piece that it's lower down, it has to itself has the dimensions, the size of a tent. What's the size of a tent? A width of a tefah. It has to have a certain width of 3 to 4 inches. If it has a width of 3 to 4 inches, then we could say it fills in the gap. So that would be that's what the Gemara wants to say over here. So everyone got it? Okay. And now comes Yosef Rav Kahana, become a Lashmaita. Rav Kahana was saying over this teaching, and Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahana, you made a statement. You made a statement that we need to have a tefach in order to fill in a gap to be considered sufficient, that we're going to say that we consider it as if it's lower down. It has to be a tefach 3 to 4 inches wide. And you're telling me this principle of chavet rami, that something that's higher up, we consider something that we consider it as if it's lower, only applies if the item has a certain width of 3 to 4 inches of a tefach. Vatanya, we learned in the Braita. What's the Braita? Hayukore hayotze. You have a beam that's going out. We are on 22A3 on the right side. You have a situation of it, let's say, of an alleyway. You have, what happens is there are houses, and in front of the houses there's a courtyard. Then in front of the courtyard, and the courtyard runs through an alley, and the alleyway runs to public property. You go from the alleyway into public domain. The alleyway belongs to the members of the courtyard. It's their private path to go to the public property, and it's surrounded on walls, and this alleyway has walls on 3 sides. There's 3 walls for this alleyway. Therefore, this alleyway, the fact that it's surrounded by 3 walls is considered private property, right? Private property is something, if you have 3 walls around an area, that area that's contained within is private. It's not public. Just like if you build a house, you put a roof, you put walls, that's called a private, that's a private property. So too, if you have something, you have walls, that means if you have walls, that means it's not a public thoroughfare. If you have walls on 3 sides, if you have walls on 2 sides, parallel walls, people just go walk through the middle. But the fact that something you can't go right through because it has 3 walls. So you have a wall here, you have a wall here, it's contained. So that situation, that's called private property. But that private property, the rabbis were concerned that people might come to make a mistake and carry from that private property, from that alleyway into public property. Because that alleyway has resemblance of public property. Because the members of the courtyard, there are multiple members of the courtyard that are sharing this alleyway, they're using this alleyway, and the same way they're using it, they're using this alleyway, they might come to use it, they keep on, and it's shared by other people. So just like the public property is shared by people, they might come to continue walking from that area of the alleyway, which is adjacent right to public property. It's open on the 4th side. So that alleyway runs right into public property. So how do you make sure that people will not come to forget, and to come to carry from that alleyway into public property? If you put up a beam that it goes across, or you put up that will go ahead and serve as a recognition to the people. This here ends the private property, and over here begin outside, begin outside this beam starts the public property. So that was the halacha to go ahead and to help make sure that people won't come to carry into public property. So Korah v'Tanya went to the Bryce. Korah hayotz mikoto zeh, ve'eina nogat mikoto zeh. If you have a beam that's going from one wall and it's not touching the other wall, so we have, let's say, we have the alleyway. I have a nice picture in my Gemara. I have a nice picture of the alleyway. I don't know if you can see from over here. If you want to show it, Simon, this picture. So you see the three walls. You see the wall all the way in the back, and you see the two side walls, right? That's the alleyway. No roof. Okay, right. There's no roof, but there's a beam, but there's three walls. But you have this. Be careful with the coffee over there. Not Mr. Haber. Watch the coffee. That should. No. I'm saying he's showing you the picture. I don't want to knock the coffee down. So you see, there's three walls. There's a wall in the back. There's two side walls, and then you put 22A3, and you place that. And they don't have a picture. And you place that beam that's going across from one wall to the other wall. So if you place it and it goes across a wall, then you're good. Well, what's the issue? But if the beam is not reaching the other wall, so what if the beam came? Let's say it's resting. Let's say you cemented the beam into the wall, so that beam, let's say you were able to you put a lot of plaster or cement on one side, and that was holding up the beam. But right, it's hanging. It's hanging. There's nothing. It's hanging. It's hanging across, but it's
moved on the wall on one side, and the other side is
the other side. It's right. It's not reaching the other wall, but somehow it's standing still. It's not falling down. So what do we say? Another situation is not that you have one beam coming out of one of the walls trying to reach the other wall. Rather, you have beam coming out from each wall. Here's a wall over here, and here's a wall over here. And I got a beam coming out of this wall, and I got a beam coming out of this wall. But the problem is each beam, but they don't meet. They don't touch each other. There's a certain separation between, it's like a half a beam and a half a beam, and there's a separation in beam number one and beam number two. So we say, do we join these two beams together to form one beam or not? Or do we say when there's a beam going from one wall and it's going to the other wall, but it doesn't reach the other wall, how much space, if it would be within the next wall, would we consider as if it reached its destination? So that's what we say. And very good. Well, we have a rule like 3 tvachim. If you're adjacent to something else, and you're within 3 tvachim, you're within 9 to 12 inches, we look at it as if that's called lavud, as if you're attached to that spot. So therefore, if this beam from this wall goes 95% towards the other wall and doesn't yet reach the other wall, but if it's within 3 tvachim of the other wall, that would be considered as if it's attached to that other wall. And similarly, these two beams, when they come out, if they come within 3 tvachim of each other, if they come within 9 to 12 inches, we look at it as if it actually connected. So that's what it says. If it's less than 3 tvachim, you don't have to bring another beam. Shlosha, but if it's 3 tvachim, distance between one and the other, then they don't connect. If you have such a separation of space, too much space is a disconnect, right? Too much. If you have too much social distance, you're not connected, right? So when the beams are too much space between them, they're not connected. So we're talking about the two walls they have. You have the two walls on the side, and you have the wall in the back. And this is the front of the alleyway, like the picture has over here. So you have a beam going from this wall to this wall. So here's the front, and you have the wall, you have the wall, two walls here. So a beam is going right across, like in this picture. So if the beam, let's say the case you have two beams, one coming from this wall, one coming from that wall. I have a nice little picture. I have a picture over here. In this case, you see there's two beams, but they came from one wall here, but they're not reaching each other. So it all depends how much space. If you have insignificant amount of space, then you're connected. Too much space, that creates too much space, creates a disconnect.
So what does that mean now? If you walk through that alleyway.
So therefore, it's as if you don't have a beam. You do not need.
You do have a beam. You carry.
But if you do have a beam, so then the members could continue carrying in the alleyway. You have that beam. But if you don't have that beam, so then there's no recognition. It's not considered a proper beam, and you won't be able to carry there. So, shlosha sarich lavi akarachet. If there's a space of 3 tvachim, you have to bring another beam. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Now we're turning the page. Pachot me'arba ein sarich lavi akarachet. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says if it's less than 4 tvachim, you do not need to bring another beam. What is that? We're on 22b now. We turn the page, 22b1. What does that mean? He holds that the law, we've been saying until now, that lavud, if you're within 3 tvachim, if the social distance is 9 to 12 inches, you're good. Between 9 and 12, there's different opinions exactly how much is 3 tvachim. Some say it's 9 inches, 11 inches, 12 inches. By the way, that is the size we said of our ravot and hadassim. What's the size to be considered? You have your own identity. It's considered a distance. It's 3 tvachim. Therefore, some say that the minimum size of hadassim and ravot, some say it's 11 inches. They say that 3 tvachim is 11 inches. So if you have a aravah, that the branch, the twig, the branch of the aravah needs to measure at least 11 inches, because that's going with the opinion that 11 inches would be 3 tvachim, and therefore that's the size that you need. That's called a size of significance. 3 tvachim, good morning, is considered something of significance. That's why they don't connect, because it's called a significance amount. If there's spacing of 3 tvachim, and therefore it itself has its own significance, that's the size for hadassim. That's the size for aravot. Less than 3 is considered an insignificant amount, and therefore would not do it. If you have hadassim and aravot that are less than 3 tvachim, I cut the aravah very, very short. I cut it less than 11 inches, we don't use it, because it's not kosher. And if you take the opinion it's 11 inches, it's the size of 3 tvachim. Some say less than 11 inches, but if you go with that opinion, but he holds pachas me'arbayin tzarich lavi kor acheret. If you're less than 4 tvachim, he says you got more than 9 to 12 inches. He said you got 12 to 16 inches. He says that, or 12 to 15. He says you got 4 tvachim on the deal. You get a space. He says 3 tvachim. Even if you have 3 tvachim in between 9 to 12 inches, that's not called significant amount of space. And therefore you would join something that's within 3 tvachim, even if it's 9 inches or 12 inches separated. He says that that's 3 tvachim, you could join it. You could have a spacing of 3.5 tvachim between one another. It's still considered not a significant amount of space. The only thing that's considered a significant amount of space is between 12 and 16 inches, meaning 4 tvachim. If it's less than a foot, it's not considered it's interesting. The measuring of a foot is, considered, we measure by a foot. It's a significant amount, a foot. There's something called 11 inches and something called 12 inches. You don't call 12 inches. It's reached a mark that they have 3 feet, is a yard, something of significance. So that's what we say also. If it reached 12 to be anywhere from 12 to 16 inches, that's already considered a significant distance. And then they don't connect. So if the beam, see, he's giving you more space in order to still be connected. If you're within 12 to 16 inches, you're still connected. But once you're past that spot, if there's spacing between one beam and another, then that's what he said. Then it's not considered connected, and you have to bring another beam. Okay, well, tomorrow we'll continue on this Gemara. We welcome everybody. Have a great day, everybody.